All right, let's jump right in. We're about to explore a real puzzle at the very heart of language education. It's a world filled with brilliant people, incredibly high stakes, and a central mystery that, honestly, even after decades, is still unsolved. So welcome to the very curious case of language-specific purposes testing.
So just think about this for a second. A really talented doctor wants to move to the UK and help people. But first, she's got to pass an English test. Sounds simple, right? Well, not so fast. What kind of test should it be? Should we test her on, I don't know, classic literature? Or on her ability to calmly explain a really tricky diagnosis to a patient who's scared? This isn't some academic thought experiment. This is a real-world problem, and it's the very thing that kicked off this entire field.
And yeah, there's a name for this whole headache. Language for Specific Purposes Testing, or LSP for short. It's this super specialized field that's all about creating tests for very, very specific situations. Think English for airline pilots, or French for chefs, or, in our case, English for doctors. It's not about testing language as this big general concept, but as a specific tool for a specific job.
Now, to really get a handle on this mystery, we have to go back to the beginning. Where did this very specific kind of problem even come from?
Well, the whole thing pretty much blew up in the 1970s. See, teaching was changing, the focus was shifting away from just memorizing grammar rules and more towards, real-world communication. And that led to a brand new question: how do we actually test if someone can use the language to do a job? LSP testing was born right out of that super practical need.
So, clue number one in our investigation seems like a total no-brainer. Just make the test as real as possible. Testers started this big hunt for something they called authenticity.
But oh man, this clue got messy, and it got messy fast. Back in the 70s, the idea was simple enough. Just copy a real-life situation. But then, a guy named Widdowson comes along and throws a real wrench in the works. He argued that a text isn't authentic by itself. It only becomes authentic because of how you, the reader, interact with it. A few years later, by the 90s, Bachman and Palmer had split the whole idea of authenticity in two. And then, by 2000, John Luvquist was asking this totally radical question: what if the people taking the tests don't actually care that much about authenticity anyway? Yeah, the plot definitely thickens.
So this split is actually the key thing to get. They basically sliced authenticity into two different flavors. On one side, you have situational authenticity. Think of this as the window dressing. Does the test look and feel the part? Are you reading from a real pilot's checklist? Is the room set up like a real doctor's office? Then you have interactional authenticity. This one's way deeper. It's all about what's happening inside your head. Is the test making your brain do the same mental gymnastics it would have to do on the actual job? It's not about the props, it's about the cognitive workout.
And this quote from Peter Skehan just nails the problem perfectly. He pointed out, way back in '84, that even something that seems dead simple, like testing a waiter's English, just falls apart the second you look closely. I mean, what kind of customers are we talking about? At a fancy 5-star restaurant or a chaotic diner? What kind of food? The second you start poking at this, you realize that real life is just way too varied, way too messy to ever perfectly capture on a standardized test.
So, right when testers are wrestling with this ghost of authenticity, a whole new clue appears. Let's call it the accomplice in the room. And that accomplice is the test taker's own specialized knowledge.
And this right here created a massive dilemma. It's the million-dollar question: if you give an engineering student a reading test with an engineering article, are you really testing their English? Or are you just testing if they're a good engineer? How in the world do you pull those two things apart?
I mean, a famous study from 1988 just says it all with the title, right? This test is unfair. I'm not an economist. It's the voice of literally every student who has ever felt like they bombed a test, not because their language skills were weak, but because they just didn't know enough about that specific topic. We've all been there.
Then, in 1996, a researcher named Caroline Clapham digs in and finds something absolutely fascinating. So, yes, it's true, students do better on tests in their own field, but, and this is a huge but, that advantage only kicks in if their language skills are already pretty decent, at an intermediate level. If your language ability is below a certain threshold, all that expert knowledge you have, it doesn't help you one bit. On the flip side, if your language skills are amazing, you can often power through even if you know nothing about the subject. So it's not a simple relationship. It's this really complex dance between what you know and what you can say.
Okay, so the crime scene is a total mess, right? We have the ghost of authenticity floating around. We've got this background knowledge accomplice muddying the waters. It's chaos. And then our detective walks in, Dan Douglas, and he arrives with a big, unifying theory that he thinks will finally crack the case.
So Douglas lays out this really elegant three-part model. He says to get a specific task done, you need three things. First, your basic language knowledge, grammar, vocab, the nuts and bolts. Second, your background knowledge, your expertise in medicine or law or whatever. But then, and this is the secret sauce, you need a third thing, strategic competence. Think of it like the little mission controller in your brain. It's the thing that looks at the task and then decides how to mix and match your language skills and your subject knowledge to get the job done.
It's a beautiful theory. It feels so neat, so tidy, like it ties everything together perfectly. But, plot twist, even this brilliant model hasn't completely solved the mystery. The case, as it turns out, is still very much open. And that brings us to the final verdict, which researcher Alan Davies summed up perfectly. He laid out this fascinating paradox. On the one hand, from a pure theory standpoint, LSP testing is kind of a mess. We still can't perfectly untangle language from knowledge. It's almost impossible to define the language of a waiter. And there's no hard proof these specific tests are any more valid than good old-fashioned general tests. But, on the other hand, in the real world, it's incredibly useful. It gets teachers and students focusing on practical skills. It looks good to employers. And hey, at the end of the day, they don't seem to predict success any worse than general tests, so why not?
So we're left with this puzzle that just won't go away. Despite all the theoretical holes you can poke in it, these specific tests have this undeniable real-world value. And that leaves us with the big question that experts are still fighting over today: what's the end game here? Do we go hyper-specific and try to create a unique test for every single job on the planet? Or do we go the other way and try to build richer, smarter, general tests that are good enough for everyone, no matter their field? The mystery, it seems, continues.